Was not a good guy at all and was literally the worst person to grow up with. He was the meanest kid ever and would never let go of any opportunity to take on me with his friends. I was a lot smaller than him, even physically, so I could never do anything except run to my mother, and that made me look even worse because it earned me the label of a mama's boy. My mother would always reprimand him, but it didn't help because my dad would always take his side and tell my mother that I needed to learn how to play rough because that's how I would become a guy. But I didn't want to learn how to be a guy, I just wanted to live in peace. And for some reason, my dad and my brother just seemed to hate the idea of me having a peaceful life. They would constantly try to bother me one way or another. My mother would try to protect me, but there was only so much she could do because it wasn't like she could constantly keep an eye on us while also doing all the household chores. She was a stay-at-home mom, and she had a lot on her plate, what with raising us and also keeping the house in order. So it was nearly impossible for her to always prevent me from getting bullied by my brother or my dad. That's how things were for me growing up, and with time, I learned to accept it and just let it go instead of constantly complaining about it and fighting against it. Then, when I was in 8th grade, my mother sat me down and told me that she was separating from my dad. At that point, I was old enough to understand that they had their reasons and this was for the best. She didn't tell me the exact reason why they were getting divorced, but I just assumed that it must have been because my dad was a horrible guy to be married to, and she just had enough, which is why she was leaving. It wasn't until much later, when I was in high school, that I found out the real reason why she had left. Apparently, my mother had found text messages on my dad's phone between him and his secretary, and that was the last straw for her because she had been putting up with enough already, but she couldn't accept infidelity. We were having a heart-to-heart chat that day, and she told me that the reason that my dad had never liked me was because he hadn't even wanted a second child, but she had refused to give me up and had even threatened him with divorce. He was just setting up his business at the time, and they were short on money. They were already having a hard time paying all the bills, and having one child was also expensive for them at the time. Another child would be difficult to handle, but my mother put her foot down and said that she was not going to give me up and would definitely go through with the pregnancy. They did have a babysitter at the time because even though my mother was working before I was born, my mother suggested that she would continue to work and would just borrow money from her dad, my grandpa, until my dad's business took off, and then they would return everything. But my dad was not on board with the idea of taking money from his father-in-law, so he told my mother that the only way he would agree to a second child was if she quit her job and stayed at home. He expected my mother to disagree with it and delete the pregnancy, but my mother didn't do so, and that's how things started falling apart between them. My mother acknowledged that both of them could have dealt with the problem better, but the way that my father had started resenting me and harming me after I was born made her feel terrible, and that's why she never tried to reconcile with him. She told me that the fact that I had such a terrible childhood was partly her fault and apologized to me for it because she felt like she should have left sooner but didn't because she believed that it would have a negative impact on us. Unfortunately, the decision to stay in that marriage is what made things much worse, and ultimately she had to leave. But after getting hurt in the worst way possible, and part of her still loves my dad even after I was born and he had started to treat me really badly, she had held out hope that maybe he would change, but that never happened, and she was just disappointed time again. So the distance between them just kept growing, and he ended up cheating. I love my mother, I really do, but I honestly think that she could have been honest with me about a lot of things way earlier than she chose to because she only told me about all of these things when I was in my final year of high school. But they got divorced when I was in middle school, and unfortunately, I had to spend every weekend with my dad. My parents had worked out a custody arrangement where I would spend the weekends with my dad, and my brother would spend the weekends with my mom. It worked because I hated spending time with my dad, and I hated my brother even more.